Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and we're back for the 574th installment of League Starter Builds for a new league. This time around, Legion Edition. So Legion has been announced, it is about to start, and it is all about the melee. A big melee rework, there's quite a lot of extra monsters and big packs to fight, and it's just supposed to be some nitty gritty a hard action sort of league with pretty much an entire melee focus. So all of the fun melee ascendancies are the ones we want to focus on for this starter video, as well as one little bit of a spellcaster just in case you want something a bit different. Now, friendly reminder, starter builds are not necessarily supposed to be the greatest, best, most flashy builds. They are just supposed to function rather well, have quite a lot of fun to start with, and work on relatively low budgets with the potential for scaling into endgame if you focus a little bit more onto it. So for the most part, they are pretty vanilla builds, and a lot of this stuff is fairly I would say provisional, given that the entire bottom side of the passive tree was largely reworked, as well as a lot of the actual ascendancies and skills themselves have been somewhat reworked too. So for the most part, this stuff should work, but we don't really have a lot of the gems out. We don't have a lot of the skills to play around with just yet, and well, we'll have to wait and see exactly how it goes once we get there. So to start off with, I will jump straight into the first build, which is most likely to be the build I'm going to try out first, and that is the Lacerate Gladiator. Now, I recommend Lacerate because I have personally made this build and played it in the last league, and Lacerate has got a nice healthy damage buff, making it much less gear required than before, and it wasn't too much of a requirement before anyway. But as well as that, the Gladiator and this entire sort of build style can, and by the looks of it, should be pretty good for the two new skills, Perforate and Blade Storm. So I'm quite likely going to be trying those skills out as I go. If both of them are kind of crappy, then Lacerate's a good fallback plan, but chances are at least one of those should be rather fun, fresh, and well, worth playing. And if they are, a Gladiator is quite often just a very solid, very fun choice for a melee character because he's got some good attack speed, he's got some real nice bleed explosions which help your clear speed but also give you some seriously satisfying gameplay with the just pops that go off all the time, and it's just a very nice, well-rounded ascendancy for melees. Hopefully the Blade Storm and Perforate are really good, but like I said, if they're not, Lacerate is the way to go, and you can just plain play Lacerate if you'd rather it, because it is actually a very strong and fun skill. So let's get straight into looking at this character. So the first build is supposed to be the Lacerate Gladiator, but as I mentioned, a lot of this stuff is very provisional because we want to try out the new skills, we want to try out plenty of the new supports as well. Currently, you can see here that Lacerate, the new gem, is going to be, well, a bit slower on the attack, a lot more physical damage added, so that means that your weapons don't have to be anywhere near as good to get the same result as before, and you'll have the whole blood and sand stance thing, which you will pretty much be incorporating in this build to try and make it function as best as possible, which means we're supposed to be using blood and sand over here, this whole thing, and for the most part it looks like it's going to be functioning the way it wants you to use it, and that is being in sand stance most of the time and then popping into blood stance for single target. And it seems as simple as just pressing one button to activate sand stance or blood stance, swapping between the two when you want to at most, and then you'll probably reserve your mana a bit differently than we did before in the form of flesh and stone, once again using sand stance, blood stance, and also the pride aura. So most of your reservation should be taken up by these three, I think, at this point, and then possibly you'll be incorporating a banner as well, but this is the type of stuff I can't include in the path of building just yet because we don't have access to it. And like I said, I would love to be able to try Blade Storm and Perforate for these skills, for this build. So trying these skills out is something I'm going to do. You don't necessarily have to, because Lacerate is just great by itself, but there's a lot of things you can try here. Lacerate, Double Strike, Cleave, the new skills, and see how you go. But the build itself is a very established one from the last League synthesis, so you can look up my Lacerate Gladiator videos, as well as the path of building link and all of the gear on my build list that you can find through my stream or the link below. And it's a very established build. It did use some pretty decent axes and gear in the end, but obviously with that added damage to Lacerate now, your axes have to be nowhere near as good. To get the same result and the same damage, we're probably looking at 300 DPS axes. Just a nice focus on attack speed though, and you will still have similar amounts of damage. And I have changed up the passive tree from the actual synthesis version of the build. Instead of going up here, we are much more localized in the duelist and marauder area. You do grab all of the impale nodes, because impale seems to be pretty damn worth using with all of these new nodes out there. Just point for point, they are rather strong. You then get the areas around here and certain axe specialization nodes, which didn't exist before. Otherwise, you're still trying to get about, 180 plus life. Customize the build to whatever you need as you go. If you need more life, get more life. More attack speed, get more attack speed. But it is pretty straightforward to just be building a gladiator this way. With axes, you're getting resolute techniques, and for the most part, you should probably be just pathing through towards resolute techniques early on. Get as many generic damage nodes as you can, so not too specific, because maybe you find swords early on, and swords are just better for you. So don't necessarily spec into all of the axes until you are ready to fully commit to axes. And as far as our ascendancy is concerned, I'm probably going to try out Arena Challenger to start with as my first 2 points, just see how it all functions. But ideally, your first 4 points should be going towards Gratuitous Violence, because as soon as you have Gratuitous Violence in the Cruel Labyrinth, that's when Gladiator starts to feel just smooth and insane. So I would recommend doing that. And then, well, the rest of it kind of just builds itself. The gear you're looking for is just life, resists, and that's all pretty easy to do. Maybe some attack speed on gloves. Maybe you can get yourself a level 1 maim chest, which is used by fossil crafting with serrated fossils. And the rest of it is pretty standard, I think. The support gems are all not really changing too much, but we may try out some of the new ones in the form of something like Pulverize, possibly Impale support. So keep your eye on that, change things up as you need to, but the build should function as it already is without any of the new stuff. The next build recommended is going to be the one spellcaster option in a sea of melee and attack based builds, because just in case you want something that is highly effective, very fun, and not melee to start your character or league out with, maybe you want to save some melee for when you get a lot of currency and really can go proper ham with it. Well, I'm recommending Ice Nova, Assassin. This is the exact character I was playing in the flashback hardcore solo self-found race, so I can tell you right now that off of starting with nothing in a much harder league than usual, it's pretty damn effective and works real nice, and is such a fun character because I usually go from one character to the next in about 30 hours of in-game playtime. However, this one lasted me 5 days and I got up to level 99, and I still, just watching these clips and videos, kind of want to log in and start playing some Ice Nova again. I just love it that much. So Ice Nova Assassin, something that starts out a little bit slow until you have all the right proper support gems. And if you're interested in this build as a starter, I do recommend checking out the videos that I have out there, because they will give you a much more of a sense of a proper guide. But it starts out a little slow. By the time you get to level 38 and get Spell Echo, that's when things really take off, because of the interaction between your Frost Bolts that you shoot out and the Ice Novas you are casting onto those Frost Bolts. you can get much more casts going with the Spell Echo gem, and like I said, if you're interested in this one, definitely check out the videos. But the build itself can still be found on my account as the only level 99 character I have, if you look that up. Otherwise, I do have the level 97's Path of Building, and it is tailor-made at this point for the hardcore playstyle, so I went with more mana, more life than I would usually get, just so I could guarantee not really dying to any one-shots and playing as safely as possible. So you don't have to do any of that for softcore, because you can compare it to my Ice Nova Occultist I played as well, and that one is quite a bit more offensive, and that gets you through the game just fine as well. Chances are, though, you'll die every now and again because you don't have the same level of hardcore defense. But this is currently built for a level 97 character, and I'd say that your last few points are just going to be taking out some of the crappier life nodes, maybe this entire thing down here, because that is quite a lot of points, and that is something I was getting as I was building more and more hardcore. Otherwise, it's a very basic passive tree. You can't really go wrong, just following the lines and then picking up your assassin ascendancies through the crit, then probably ambush, assassinate, maybe opportunistic, depending on what you want to prioritize if you want to run a bit faster earlier on. Builds itself in just that sort of way for the passive tree, but the items and stuff are a little bit customizable. I went with dual wands because I wanted as much cast speed as possible. I went with a Carcass Jack because I want a lot of area, and I think the overlap really lends itself nicely to helping Ice Nova clear and do good single target damage. And the rest of the gear can be pretty straightforward. It's just resist life gear, and you can make it so much better if you invest a lot more into it, which didn't have the option of since I was playing solo self-found. Now, the only other main difference is that Warlord's Mark Curse no longer works for our spellcaster builds, so I think the main recommendation to help deal with mana is either spec into more mana nodes, get a mana flask, or something that I played around with is Stormbrand, being your utility skill, having Onslaught, so it procs Onslaught for you, as well as Mana Leech, so it's actually leeching mana back, and also Ice Bite, giving you frenzy charges, so then your Stormbrand that you're throwing out almost every pack is giving you 3 different types of benefits. You can then also run an Atziri Flask for a bit of extra leech, but for the most part, leech isn't too important here because you're not supposed to be taking much damage with how you freeze everything and the ranged defensive playstyle you have of Ice Nova. If you want more info on how to build the character, the interaction between Ice Nova and Frostbolt, like I said, I do strongly recommend checking out the videos. Long story short though, you get your Frostbolts, get at least 3 of them going whenever you cast. If you cast Ice Nova, then it'll cast onto your Frostbolts as they're cascading out. Once you get Spell Echo, every Ice Nova you cast will be cast 4 times onto your Frostbolts, and that's why the interaction there is so powerful. The next build in line is some good old-fashioned Cyclone, which has been somewhat reworked to, well, it looks a lot better. It's got more damage, better area. It's now a channeled skill, so you can support it with certain other gems. And overall, it should just be a very solid melee build and a good starter. And it is going to be a Slayer, primarily because Slayer has a few good nodes for bossing, which Cyclone does need some help with. As well as that, there is the really good crit node that now lets just about any weapon you want become crit, and then the area nodes that give you quite a lot of extra area. So there seems to be quite a lot of synergy with the Slayer and Cyclone this league, and I'm gonna just pitch you one that's pretty stock standard with dual wield foils. Shouldn't require any gear, but should scale rather nicely. And we can't quite use all of the scalings right now because, well, we don't have all of the gems properly inputted into Path of Building yet. So you'll have to play around with a few of the gems as you get there. And you can very easily customize the weapon choices to whatever you really want them to be. Doesn't necessarily have to be 2 swords. It could easily be a 2-handed sword, 2-handed axe, all kinds of other stuff. Because, well, the crit node does let you become crit anything. So let's jump into looking at the Cyclone Slayer. So the new gem info for Cyclone does show that it's got more physical damage added to it now. So you could quite easily have shitter items and weapons. So all I'm really asking you to do is get some fast foils that have a small amount of physical on them. The crit is taken care of by Slayer itself. It's also got more range than it used to, and has slightly different mana cost scaling, so you could quite easily take care of the mana cost with this one just by crafting a minus mana cost ring at some point. Now there are going to be some extra gems that you probably want to put in that previously didn't exist or didn't function that well. Possibly an Impale, possibly some Pulverize. You might want to try out some Shockwave, see how that goes. And also you will most likely be using Infused Channeling, because that will now function to give you quite a lot more damage, as well as infuse you for physical and protect you from some damage too. So it seems like a very nice support for Cyclone in this coming patch. And it's also entirely possible you try out some Rage, maybe even some Fortify if you want just that added bit of safety. So to jump into the actual skills itself or the build, that's currently what the tree should kind of look like. It's going a bit everywhere. You do want some sword crit nodes, and there are plenty of ways of building these, so you can maybe look around at other people's versions too, but I'm trying to still maintain a decent bit of life while getting just about all the crit that you possibly can on the tree, and then of course still the Impale nodes, because as I mentioned they are rather strong right now. And then we also got Soul of Steel, because well, you probably want to be taking a few less hard hits as Cyclone, and since our Ascendancy is currently very heavily tailored towards damage, you might want to spec into a little bit of defense here or there. Overwhelm looks like it should be extremely strong, because 8 base crit to your weapons is absolutely huge, and it does let you just have some really crappy items like this. Just basic amount of fizz, some good attack speed, don't have to worry about the crit at all, which is usually historically expensive on these types of weapons, because the crit is just going to get bumped up to 8 by itself, and that means that your gear doesn't need to be that strong. There's a lot of inherent scaling coming from Slayer and a lot of inherent scaling coming from Cyclone. So overall, it should be a very smooth and easy start. And then as well as that, you get impact for all kinds of extra area. And the area on this type of character with the scaling we have seems like it should be quite fat and make Cyclone very enjoyable at the moment. If I were to be building this, I would probably go to the left first and then over to the right once I had the right crit and all of that. You don't want to fill out your crit too early on unless you really are getting this node immediately. But I couldn't honestly tell you which of these to take first, because it just depends how you're going to prioritize your gearing and your leveling process. Quite possible that you want impact first just for some feel good. Maybe you want to start getting crit first and scaling all of that. Or maybe you just want to go into the more damage so you can ultimately get the cull and faster movement speed immediately. I couldn't honestly tell you. They're all really good choices. As far as the gear, like I said, you probably want some foils, but you could easily respec this into being two-handed swords with something like a Doom Sower. You could go two-handed axes. Ultimately, a disfavor version of this build would probably be the strongest thing you could do on still somewhat of a budget. I think a Duresso's Defiance chest should synergize quite well with this build, giving you that extra onslaught effect, and when you run a Silver Flask, that means you're going to be gaining quite a lot of extra movement speed. And overall the gear should be pretty straightforward, just a bit of life, accuracy, and gearing towards what should be somewhat similar gems for the Lacerate Gladiator. So you're still going to be probably running Dread Banner, Vile Ancestral Warchief, and your reservations would quite possibly be the Blood and Sand and Flesh and Stone and Pride, things like that. So I think you're probably going to be building this one as pure Fizz, doing some Brutality, Melee Fizz, and then a bunch of the new supports, I would imagine. But that's something you're going to have to play around with as you go. But I don't think it's going to be a very challenging build to put together. Just all of that scaling is going to come together by itself, and the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out, but I think it's going to work pretty well on a budget. The next one is going to be quite provisional indeed, and that is Viper Strike. So much so that I don't even have any footage of it from recent times, because the last time I played it would have been 2 or 3 years ago, as you can see in these pretty old clips. There hasn't been too many big changes, but in this recent change, it does have quite a lot of extra added chaos damage, roughly equal to the added chaos damage support. And with all the new melee tweaks and improvements, Viper Strike is looking like it's going to be quite a force to be reckoned with, especially on the poison end of things. I would probably play this myself if it wasn't for all of the new shit. I'm actually quite excited to jump into this one, but I definitely want to try out the new stuff first, so I can't possibly justify doing the Viper Strike. However, the damage numbers behind it seem to be absolutely absurd, as I'll show you in a second, and I think it's going to be one that's just kind of hard to screw up, because you just take like a good half of your passive tree and a couple of basic items, and you are looking at well over 1 million damage from poison, and it's going to just go higher and higher the more you fine-tune it. And I'd say that ultimately all of these good extra changes for the melee and also for Pathfinder recently are going to make it quite delicious to play with. And let's jump into it and see what it looks like. So the gem itself hasn't really changed too much, except for one glaringly obvious factor in the form of 169 to 254 added attack chaos damage, which is pretty much equivalent to the level 20 added chaos gem. So with just those two things combined, you can be sitting at like 300 to 500 added chaos damage, and that's a huge base to work off of for all of your poison shenanigans. So it's quite a lot of extra damage, and that does mean a lot of scaling that isn't like based off of gear, and it's just stuff you get regardless. So the build itself ends up looking like this, with the 2 wasp nests, which I have used to incorporate the added chaos from the new Viper Strike onto. So this 250 to 370 is the wasp nest damage plus the added chaos on the new Viper Strike gem, since POB does not currently have that incorporated into Viper Strike. So that's pretty basic setup. Wasp nests are very easy to get. You can start out with Mortem Morsus otherwise. That'll also be quite good. And the passive tree just goes around grabbing all the one-hand nodes that give some ailment damage, some claw nodes that give ailment damage, and a few poison nodes here, here, and down here. And otherwise, it's just fast attacking, stacking poison damage, getting some life on the tree, and should be pretty nice dual wielding action. You're trying to get a decent amount of life. You are going to be taking these Pathfinder passives because they're quite strong for added damage, and then especially the Prolif, poison spreading after you kill a certain poisoned enemy. And overall, I think it should function as a rather large single target damage. As you can see, 2.8 million in the single target, but also a very strong clear speed monster when factoring in Ancestral Call and Melee Splash, which you would quite likely use over the top of these two and then sub in these two for single target, or just play around with it and see what you need. Maybe you don't need Melee Splash, maybe you don't need Ancestral Call, but these are the 6 links, and these are the 2 area links, interchangeable. And quite possibly you don't even need added chaos, because you will get a lot of chaos scaling through the Viper Strike itself, and then added chaos damage through the Despair Curse, which comes from Witchfire Brew, from the Wasp Nests, and other such things. You can use something like Lesser Poison, or you can use, instead of a Cherubims, a Dendrobate, but I don't think it's strictly necessary in this type of a setup, because Viper Strike already has a long enough poison duration that the poison duration probably isn't that strong, and you get a lot from Coralitos as well. Overall, Viper Strike poison duration is like 10 seconds, so you're really only maximizing this 2 to 3 million DPS against the biggest of targets. Otherwise, things should die pretty quickly anyway. And you should be using a Growing Agony Jewel, Threshold Jewel, at least one of those. Otherwise, we're just trying to focus on getting some accuracy, some life, flat physical if you can, and the added chaos crafts too. Other than that, you will probably run Malevolence Aura, maybe Herald of Agony, maybe Herald of Purity, and of course a Wither Totem with Spell Totem and Multi-Totems. When you drop one of these guys, it will probably most often get 15 stacks of Withered up on an enemy almost immediately, and it is a huge single target boost as well. You can reference my last Wasp Nest Poison build from probably about a year ago or so, and it's close enough, but a lot of things have changed since then in the Pathfinder Ascendancy. And if you're going to be building this, I would recommend grabbing the first 4 points here, and then grabbing potentially that, depending if you want to go a little bit faster or be a little bit safer. And then lastly, I wanted to go ahead and recommend some hot Blade Flurry action with a Berserker. Berserker in its current rework is getting a huge amount of added damage as well as attack speed, and that should make for a very fast and enjoyable Blade Flurry playstyle. As well as that, it's got some flat physical, and Blade Flurry itself has some flat physical in this little melee rework. Now, Blade Flurry has been a very good skill for the past couple years still. It has had a few nerfs and all of that, and it hasn't been the best on clear speed because the area has got nerfed several times. While the damage has still been very good, it's been a high tier single target skill, the area hasn't been super good, so you've usually used something else. This current next rework also increases its area, and the pulverized gem should probably factor into this build to give you even more area. So ultimately, I think Blade Flurry should be a fine clear by itself, and you don't necessarily have to resort to another gem this time around, though you could also incorporate Hemophilia into the build if you feel like you need the extra explosions, but we'll have to wait and see if that's truly necessary. However, I do think this is the type of build that just scales huge on damage with little gear and should have a fun and active playstyle. So the new Blade Flurry gem does have what seems to be more attack speed, but most importantly that huge amount of added physical damage, 75 to 113. So your weapons, once again, don't have to be that good, especially on Berserker, who's got a bunch of flat physical as well. So just to begin with, all you really need is a bit of attack speed, maybe some crit on your weapons. And on top of that, the new gems like Pulverize seem like they should synergize very well with Berserker plus something like Blade Flurry. You might want to try out some Impale as well, since we will be stacking a bit of Impale. Maybe some close combat, not too sure about that, but Infused Channeling is another one that should provide a large damage boost while also providing somewhat of a defensive boost. After that, we are then looking at the Berserker Ascendancy here. Now, we're not quite sure how it's going to function just yet with Blitz, but going all the way through the Rage passives should be a no-brainer because it's a huge amount of attack speed and damage, the kind that just fills out an entire passive tree. Then Flawless Savagery, definitely worth grabbing. Whether or not Blitz is worth grabbing is to be seen, so try it out. If you don't like it, if it's hard to sustain, then I think you could quite easily justify taking Aspect of Carnage instead, which is a lot more damage, a little bit more damage taken though, but however, it's nowhere near as much attack speed, so we'll see how that goes. And you know, I do want you guys to experiment with it if you're going to play Berserker. It might not necessarily be the right move to always take Blitz. But other than that, it's a pretty standard sword skill tree. So you are going through there, getting all the crit nodes, grabbing some of the little defensive nodes down there, getting the area sword nodes, the impale stuff, and then getting the leech and traveling all the way over here for more sword nodes and a bit more life. Berserkers do tend to want a little bit more life, so 190%, maybe even higher. Since there's probably going to be an overkill of damage in this build, you could easily justify more life, maybe grabbing these strength nodes too, but otherwise pretty standard build. Get a Scaver in the main hand most likely, since it's a very nice easy weapon to get from the start, but you could eventually upgrade it to have foils that do a bit of crit, bit of attack speed, bit of physical. Ultimately, a lot of the physical in your build is filled out through the gems themselves, so you don't have to get that much on your weapons. Maybe some Star Conjure action helps fill out your dexterity to use these things, Like I mentioned, hemophilias do help the bleed explosions for clear. That might come into play here, not necessarily going to be all that crucial because it could just be fine without the bleed explosions, but it does usually make it a bit more fun. And then otherwise, a bit of accuracy, flat viz, assassin mark ring would be nice. And if you're doing duels, try and get a bit of attack speed, crit multi, maybe some damage, possibly some life. And Lion's Roar, well, that's probably going to factor into just about every build this league. So that might be a tough one to get, but it is definitely something that's going to increase your damage quite a bit. Otherwise, Dread Banner using Blood Rage, similar to the others, you're probably going to be using the Blood stance or Sand stance, depending on your situation, as well as Pride, all of that new melee shit, and trying out all of the supports. But currently, that's probably what the supports look like. You might want to go same as the other character, a maim chest from Serrated Fossils, and otherwise try out a couple of the other new supports. So I'd say that's about it for the starter builds. I will post a link to all of these on the description just below in the YouTube. For the most part, I think they all should scale very nicely by themselves and just obviously need plenty of fine-tuning and refining as you go into the higher levels. Customize it for hardcore or softcore, your own playstyle. If you want more attack speed, more life, want to spend a bit more, all of that is highly customizable. My Ice Nova character that went to level 99 went through quite a lot of changes and just, you know, little fine-tunes and tweaks every few levels in the end game as you kind of desire different things and feel out what you need in your character and what you're coming across. Since we have no idea what Legion's going to bring, maybe it's going to have to be something you're heavily building into with defense. Who knows? So like I said, I probably want to try out some Gladiator action and try out the new skills. I have no idea what's going to come next though, so let's look forward for Legion. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.